10,000 years before the first Egyptian stone was ever lifted into place, someone had already built a monument so advanced that when archaeologists found it, they assumed it had to be a mistake in the dating. They were wrong. It was real. Wait, and it quietly rewrote everything we thought we knew about the dawn of civilization. Here's the story we all grew up with. Humans were scattered hunter-gatherers, wandering in tiny bands, chasing herds and berries, too busy surviving to build anything permanent. Then, around 6,000 years ago, agriculture appeared, cities followed, and civilization switched on like a light. Farming came first. Religion and monuments came later, as a kind of luxury only settled societies could afford. That's the textbook version. It's tidy, it's logical. It fits neatly into a single paragraph of a school syllabus, and it might be completely backwards. In 1994, a German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt started digging into a hill in southeastern Turkey called Gobekli Tepe, a name that simply means Potbelly Hill. What he found were massive carved stone pillars arranged in circles, some weighing over 10 tons, decorated with foxes, scorpions, vultures, and boars. Radiocarbon dating placed the site at roughly 11,600 years old. That's over 6,000 years before Stonehenge. Over 7,000 years before the Great Pyramid of Giza. To put that in perspective, the distance in time between Gobekli Tepe and the pyramids is longer than the distance in time between the pyramids and us. And here's the thing, there was no evidence of farming at the site. No domesticated grain, no permanent village, no pottery for storing surplus food. Just hunter-gatherers, moving multi-ton stone with nothing but muscle, rope and timber, building something enormous for reasons that had nothing to do with food or shelter. Now, why does this matter so much? Because it flips the old assumption on its head. For decades, archaeologists believed people needed farming and food surplus before they could afford the luxury of religion, art, and monumental architecture. The logic seemed airtight. You can't organize a workforce to carve 10-ton pillars if everyone is out foraging for their next meal. Gobekli Tepe suggests the opposite might be true. Maybe it was the gathering itself, the shared ritual, the shared belief that pulled scattered bands together in the first place, and farming came afterward, almost by accident, as a side effect of feeding the crowds who kept showing up year after year to build and rebuild. Alright, let's dig into the science of how this was even physically possible. Each pillar at Gobekli Tepe is a T-shaped monolith, some standing over 5 meters tall and weighing as much as 16 tons. Quarried limestone blocks that size don't move themselves, and there's a quarry nearby, still littered with a half-finished pillar that was apparently abandoned mid-carving. Modern experiments estimate it would have taken groups of at least 50 people working together with sledges, log rollers, and rope made from plant fiber to drag a single stone from the quarry, roughly a few hundred meters away, to its final position. No wheels, no draft animals, no metal tools of any kind. Just coordinated human labor, precise engineering intuition passed down without writing, and, most strikingly, enough social organization to plan and execute the whole thing across multiple building phases spanning centuries. That last part is the real revelation. Building something like this requires more than muscle. It requires a shared calendar, food supplies to feed the workers, leadership to coordinate the effort, and a belief system compelling enough to make hundreds of people commit months, maybe years, of their lives to hauling rock for no immediate material reward whatsoever. This is where the story gets even stranger. Around 10,000 years ago, long after it was built, Gobekli Tepe was deliberately buried. Not destroyed by invaders, not abandoned to slow decay, but intentionally filled in with rubble, sediment, and debris, layer by layer, by the very people who had built and maintained it. Nobody fully agrees on why. Some archaeologists think it was a ritual closing, a symbolic ending once the site's spiritual purpose had been fulfilled, a bit like consecrating a grave. Others suggest a shifting climate or a slow transition toward farming economies elsewhere made the old gathering site less central to daily survival, and it was simply retired. Either way, the burial is almost accidentally the reason it survived so well preserved. A monument left exposed for 11,000 years erodes to almost nothing. A monument sealed under earth becomes a time capsule. Now, here's a what-if worth sitting with for a moment. What if Gobekli Tepe isn't unique, but simply the first example we happen to dig up? Turkey alone has several similar sites nearby, Caral and Ggantija among them, still being excavated, still revealing carved pillars and structures from roughly the same era. If hunter-gatherer societies across the ancient Near East were capable of this kind of coordinated monument building 11,000 years ago, then how much of human prehistory is still buried, quite literally, under the ground we walk on every day? Every oldest temple and first city claim in the history books might just be the oldest one we've found so far, not the oldest one that ever actually existed. History, in that sense, isn't fixed. It's provisional, waiting to be revised by the next lucky trench. Alright, let's widen the lens to the bigger societal picture, because the implications go far beyond one hilltop in Turkey. Gobekli Tepe forces a rethink of the entire timeline of civilization. Historians used to describe a clean, linear progression: hunting and gathering, then agriculture, then villages, then cities, then temples and kings, each step unlocking the next like a technology tree in a strategy game. Gobekli Tepe suggests a messier, more tangled sequence, where religion and ritual gathering might have come first, and everything else, farming included, evolved to support that gathering, rather than the other way around. If true, this reframes agriculture itself not as some brilliant leap forward that unlocks civilization out of nowhere, but as a practical, almost improvised solution to a problem religion had already created. How do you keep feeding thousands of people who keep returning, generation after generation, to the same sacred hill? Honestly, there's an economic angle here too, one that's easy to miss if you're only looking at the stones. Managing the labor, food and materials needed to build and maintain a site like this would have required something close to proto-economics. Someone had to track who contributed what, how much grain or wild game was needed to sustain a workforce of hundreds, and how resources were fairly distributed among different bands traveling from potentially hundreds of kilometers away, each with their own dialect and customs. Some researchers argue this kind of organizational complexity, born from a religious construction project rather than farming, planted the earliest seeds of hierarchy, specialized labor, and eventually formal economic systems entirely. In other words, the accountant may have been invented to serve the priest, not the farmer. In fact, it's not only Turkey rewriting the timeline. Around the world, similar puzzles keep surfacing, as if the ground itself is slowly leaking secrets. In Peru, the ruins at Caral date back roughly 5,000 years, making it one of the oldest urban centers anywhere in the Americas, built without the wheel, without a written language as we'd recognize it, and remarkably, with almost no evidence of warfare or weapons at all. In Malta, temple complexes like Ggantija predate the pyramids by centuries, built by a small island population using nothing but stone tools and enormous patience. Each of these sites tells a version of the same underlying story: complex, monumental, deeply organized human activity appearing earlier and in more places than the old textbook timeline ever accounted for. It's starting to look less like a single birthplace of civilization and more like a pattern that kept happening independently, wherever people gathered in large enough numbers around a shared belief. Now, what does the future of this kind of research actually look like? Ground-penetrating radar and satellite imaging are transforming archaeology from a shovel-first discipline into something closer to remote sensing. Researchers can now scan for buried anomalies across huge stretches of land without breaking a single square of ground, flagging promising sites before a trowel ever touches the soil. Combine that with climate change, which is literally melting ice, and shifting sands to expose structures that have been hidden for millennia, and the coming decades could bring discoveries that make Gobekli Tepe look like a footnote rather than a headline. Every year, it seems, the accepted timeline for when civilization truly began keeps sliding a little further back into the past, and honestly, nobody knows exactly where that sliding stops. Believe it or not, here's the thing worth remembering as you close this video. History isn't a fixed record waiting patiently to be read off a shelf. It's an active excavation, quite literally, of assumptions we didn't even know we were making. We assumed farming came first because it seemed logical to us, looking backward with modern eyes. We assumed hunter-gatherers were too busy surviving to build monuments because that fit a tidy, comfortable narrative about progress. Gobekli Tepe, and the sites now following in its footsteps, suggest that human beings were organizing, believing, and building on a massive scale long before we ever gave them any credit for it. The real question isn't what happened before history. It's how much of before history is still sitting out there, buried under some quiet hill somewhere, waiting for someone to start digging.